war, massacre, genocide. Man's inhumanity to man has a long and bloody history. The world watched in horror in the early 1990s at the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and the slaughter in Rwanda. Up to 1 million people died as the United Nations stood by and did nothing. By 1999, NATO's military action in Kosovo seemed to show that lives could be saved when the West intervenes. A leading advocate of such humanitarian intervention is the renowned French journalist, writer and philosopher Bernard-Henri Levy. He's the man who's said to have personally persuaded President Sarkozy of France to go to war against Gaddafi. And he now wants similar action in Syria. But what Levy calls humanitarian or liberal intervention, others see as Western imperialism. I'm Mehdi Hasan, and I've come here to the Oxford Union to go head-to-head with Bernard-Henri Levy in front of an audience to challenge him on the rights and wrongs of humanitarian intervention. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome our guest tonight, Bernard-Henri Levy. France's most famous thinker believes Western military power can be a force for good. Thank you for joining us here on Head to Head on Al Jazeera, Bernard. You're famous for a lot of things, but you're most famous these days for your support for foreign interventions, for humanitarian interventions, what's called liberal intervention as well in places like Kosovo, Bosnia, most famously recently Libya. What you call humanitarian intervention, some of your critics call humanitarian imperialism. Tell us what you think the difference is between those two concepts.
The difference is obvious. Imperialist intervention means intervention in order to control a country, in order to stay, in order to put the country in which you intervene under pressure and so on. Humanitarian intervention is a free intervention without other motive, without other reason than stopping a bloodbath.
So just to be clear, you see it as a moral argument. The intervention is a moral cause when you make the case for those interventions.
Yes, the interventions for which I advocated in my life were all interventions which unique aim was to save a people. What you call humanitarian intervention, and which I just call intervention itself, means that I believe that the tyrants, the despots, have not the sovereign right to kill their own people. There is a unity of mankind, and when a Bosnian woman is raped, when some children in Kosovo are killed, when Gaddafi asks his troops to erase Benghazi, I feel concerned. Okay. And I know that a lot of people in all the world feel concerned.
Yes. We all feel concerned. I hope those of us with hearts would feel concerned. Here's my question. In the real world, what are the criteria that you apply, the tests you set before you call for an intervention in a particular faraway foreign land?
The criterion of massacre, the memory of the worst of 20th century. We went through the worst.
But anywhere there's a massacre, the international community of the West should intervene?
Anywhere where there is a massacre, there is a moral duty, of course.
So let's look at what's happening in the world right now. One of the biggest conflicts, a place where several massacres have been carried out, a lot of bloodshed, Syria. Is it time to intervene? And if so, what shape should that intervention, what form should it take?
It's time since the beginning, when a chief of state like Bashar al-Assad affords himself again to kill thousands, 10,000s, now probably over 100,000 of his own citizens. Of course, it is time to stop that. And regardless any political analysis...
How do you stop that? We all want it to stop, but how?
How? By preventing the planes of Bashar al-Assad since the first day it was possible to take off and to bomb. By preventing his armored vehicles to go from one city to another one, by introducing what the Arab League asked, a non-fly zone.
And there are no costs or consequences to this, negative costs, negative consequences.
The question is not if there would be some negative consequences. The question is to know if the negative consequences would be heavier or lighter than what is happening today. The only question is that we are not in an ideal world. Of course, you cannot do the good with a big capital letter to the question is that the cost of the intervention, will it be more higher or not than the cost of the non-intervention?
Exactly. And on that specific point, Kofi Annan, who was the former UN envoy, special envoy to Syria, he said he was opposed to the kind of intervention you're advocating because he said we've got to be careful we don't introduce a medicine that's worse than the disease.
I'm not sure that Mr. Annan would say the same thing today. The counter has grown up a lot. When he said that, it was already a lot. I don't know how many thousands. Today, 100,000. I would like all the viewers of this program to try to imagine what it means 100,000 times one child, one woman, one man killed in sometimes atrocious conditions.
So let's assume a thought experiment that we take your view, we put up the no-fly zones, we take out Assad. Say some faction in the Free Syrian Army, the FSA, takes over and decides, and this happens in revolutions, to take revenge on the community that backed Assad, carries out massacres against the Alawites. Whose responsibility is that? We talk about moral responsibility. Would that not be partly our moral responsibility, the people who die in that?
First of all, this risk, which you are telling about, is real and is more and more real every day. An intervention, when it will happen, and it will happen, should be submitted to conditions, to political conditions, to military conditions, and so on. Now, this being said, humanity is not divided between demons and angels. Of course, there is no angels anywhere, and not more than anywhere else in the ranks of Syrian rebellion. But we cannot let the bloodbath go on like this, with the arms crossed like this, and counting the deads.
But is the alternative, when I hear liberal interventionists make this case, it always seems to be either we bomb or we do nothing. Is there no middle ground? Is there no coercive diplomacy? Is there no...
No.
There's no solution but war.
Coercive diplomacy, it has been tried for months and years. The coercive diplomacy has been tried. The sanctions have been implemented. It does not work.
Let's bring in our panel. Peter Oborne is one of Britain's leading conservative commentators. He's the co-author of a new book, Dangerous Delusion, Why the West is Wrong About Nuclear Iran. Peter, you're listening to Bernard speak here about Syria. He says we should have intervened from day one and it could have been stopped from day one. Do you agree with that?
We have been intervening since day one. We have been smiling on the Qatar and the Saudi funding billions of pounds of cash, arms, armed men into Syria. That has broadly been an intervention right from the start. We've allowed that to happen. We've encouraged our Qatari and
you
Saudi...
think that's made things worse rather than...
Well, it's clearly caused what is now a civil war.
Why are we obliged to leave the road to Qatar? Are we obliged to leave to Saudi Arabia the responsibility of intervening? There is a competition between us, as you say, which is not only the Westerners, which are the Democrats and the fundamentalists. There is a competition. And I would even say that today in Syria, there is a race, a speed race between the fundamentalist Islamists and the Democrats in order to know who will liberate the Syrian people. It would be a disaster, of course, if the credit for liberation was to be given in a few weeks, months, I don't know, to the fundamentalists. The world is not divided between West and rest. The world is divided between Democrats and non-Democrats.
So it's okay, only Democrats can intervene then?
Okay, let me
just bring in... As much as possible, of course.
Okay, let me bring in Salma Yaqub, is a former leader of the Anti-War Respect Party here in the UK. She's one of the founding members of the Stop the War Coalition. Bernard has given his view on how to stop the war. What would you do instead?
It comes down to two very basic things. Either you militarily intervene or you have a diplomatic intervention. And the reality is, no matter what military intervention you do, you come back to the point of diplomacy. I mean, even Afghanistan, They will negotiate with the Taliban and have a power-sharing government in the end. So why have all this needless loss of life? And I don't think at all that when you say that this is going to reduce the bloodshed, it's increasing it. As Peter said, the intervention is already happening. We're already working with people who are actually not for democracy. The irony is this: whilst we have all this focus on Syria, there is a brutal repression going on in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Yemen, but we're not hearing about the need for intervention over there. And in fact, these are the very people who agreed to the intervention in Libya on the basis of this deal, that people would stay quiet about what they do to their own people. So I think your argument would be more credible if we saw some consistency.
I was asked at the beginning, what is the criterion of intervention? This is a pragmatic question. There is not a theory of the good intervention. It depends. When you arrive to a level of crime, which is what is happening today in Syria, there is no question.
You don't buy the argument that critics of intervention make, which is that there are double standards, and there are not double standards.
Of course not.
No double standards.
Of course not.
So when the United States of America turns a blind eye to what's happening in Bahrain,
number one is the cause,
but goes after Syria, that's not a double standard.
Number one is the cause just.
Okay.
Number two is the intervention doable.
Yep.
Number three is there on the ground and a moral, political authority
so far,
able
tick for Bahrain.
In Bahrain, the cause is just. I think that it is not doable today.
It's not doable to take on little Bahrain, but we can take on Syria.
No.
Really?
No. I think that
the US Fifth Fleet is already there.
No. You have a difference. On Syria, you have the Arab League, who took a very strong stand since the beginning, who excluded Bashar al-Assad. You have to take into account also the regional situation and so on. He has some neighbors who want to get rid of him. It just tells you that Bashar al-Assad is weak, that Bashar al-Assad is a paper tiger because he is weak, therefore it is doable.
Okay. Let me bring in Dr. Rama Mani from Oxford University Centre for International Studies. You've co-authored a book on the responsibility to protect. You've also visited places like Rwanda and Kosovo and Afghanistan as part of UN peace missions. What do you say to the argument that the geopolitics undermines it?
The fact that we finally have a public intellectual who is doing what a philosopher ought to be doing in all of our countries, which is speaking reason and trying to guide the actions of our self-interested politicians, he's not the one to be criticized. If all the interventions that we do or do not agree on are not morally just, it's not because of his argument, it's because the Security Council then decides to act in ways that defend their vested interests. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
What I'm fascinated by in this debate about responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention, which are on paper definitely, in theory, very noble concepts, in practice, would you agree that that right should be extended, the right of intervention, of interference, should be extended to the global south, the developing countries, whatever phrase you want to use? It's a reciprocal right. At the moment, it seems to be only a right for the great powers.
If there was a new Nazi regime in Germany or a new Pétainist regime in France, I would, of course, be happy if Rwanda, civilian society, having gone through all its terrible experience, would come to help the freedom fighters in France.
On France, you mentioned France.
Yeah.
You said recently that France is becoming the first anti-totalitarian force in the world. When there is a fight for liberty to be led, France is on the front line. Is this the same France that propped up the Tunisian dictator Ben Ali right up until the very last minute?
No.
Offered him paratroops?
It's a different France. It's the reverse.
It just changed overnight? Same president?
No, since always you have two France, as you have probably two England. You have the France of the Pétain regime, you have the France of the Commune massacre, you have this tradition which is a very dark one, and you have an enlightened France. Sometimes one prevails, sometimes the other one. I just say that in Bosnia, in Libya, and in Mali, the bright side of France has prevailed. That's
Even
all.
if it's the same president? It was the same President Sarkozy in Libya and in Tunisia?
Of course.
So how do we judge him?
Sarkozy said it very precisely. I asked him exactly that. Why did you intervene in Libya, though you did not do it, you did not do anything, and you even proposed to help the security forces in Tunisia. He said, it was my regret. I thought I was wrong in Tunisia, and I tried to
make amends.
Yes, of course.
One intervention which you played a key role in, some say, you may have hinted at in the past, was persuading the French and the British and the Americans to intervene in Libya. Do you believe that was a moral, political and legal success looking back on the Libyan intervention?
It was a moral success for sure. It was the interventionist Europeans and Arabs saved civil societies, saved some civilians, prevented a bloodbath, and the consequence is not so bad. Among the three countries who went through a so-called Arab Spring, the only one where fundamentalists are not in power in Libya. Muslim brothers are in power in Tunisia, are in power in Egypt. They are not in power in Libya. It's a sort of success, yes, of course.
A Human Rights Watch researcher in Libya said last year, and I quote, "People are turning up dead in detention at an alarming rate. If this was happening under any Arab dictatorship, there would be an outcry." You don't seem to have an outcry on this. You're saying it's a success. There's a lot of people dead in Libya, a lot of people tortured. And in February of this year, they released a report on Tawega, a town of 40,000 which has disappeared, ethnically cleansed. Black Africans, gone. You said to Sarkozy that the stain of the blood of the people of Benghazi will be on the French flag. Couldn't you argue that the stain of the people who have been killed by Libyan rebels is also on the French flag?
No. I say it to the French, and I say it to my friend Ali Zaidan, and I say it to Mustafa Abdel Jalil when he was in power. Of course, that this is absolutely unexcusable. Of course, that it is a stain of blood of the flag, more than France, flag of freedom.
Given the reports and given the numbers of militias and armed gangs and various people who turned up in Libya after the war, during the war, I'm just wondering, looking back, you don't have any regrets about getting in bed with some rather unsavory characters?
No regrets, of course, no regrets. It was the longest dictatorship in the world. It was one of the most bloody dictatorships. A people has been liberated from that. There were some free elections, first time after 42 years. These free elections happened rather well. And they gave the power to Democrats, Westerners, friends of dialogue of civilization. This is a success. Now there is armed gangs, there is militias, there is my friend Ambassador Stevens, who was killed in horrible conditions.
The French embassy has been attacked.
You have terrorist acts like a few weeks ago, French embassy. Of course, it is not a path of roses. I did not expect that. But I think we have to be proud of what we did in Libya, even if it will take time.
The moral question is this. If a dictator in a faraway country oppresses his people, you and I are at best indirectly responsible for watching. We're not directly implicated in the bloodshed. If we arm people to take him out and they then carry out human rights abuses, aren't we directly responsible for that bloodshed?
Of course, of course. That's why, number one, we have to try to put some conditions. Number two, we have to try to keep the eyes, not eyes wide shut, but eyes wide open when we implement these sorts of interventions. We have to deal in history with gray areas, with not the good, but the less worst, not even the best, the least worst, if I dare say that in English.
Salma Yaqub, Libya worked as a humanitarian intervention. What would your response be to that?
Of course it hasn't. I mean, we've heard these gushing words of these democratic elections. They were so free, they didn't even publish the members on the list. The fact is, when you've had dictatorships, when there hasn't been that civil society, when you haven't got a history and tradition of political parties operating, the idea that you can just bomb your way in and suddenly it's going to magically happen, of course it didn't happen. What we've got is a civil war. I agree at one point that it is a grey world. And we have to look at the pragmatics and what's the least worst. What we've got now is not the least worst. We've created a worse situation, and I think that the intervention has been a disaster.
Dr. Rahman, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I want to come in on this point and say, one, that if I believe you started fighting for the option of an intervention, of an armed intervention, only when you were clear that all the other options had been tried and failed. And that's what we keep forgetting. If we have genuinely tried all the options and if they have all failed, then we think about force. And when we think about force, I think all of us would agree, definitely the two of us would, that arming people on the ground, like we're doing now in Syria and has already been done, is the worst. I believe that all of these interventions were bad until I went myself and spoke to every single a person on every single side in Kosovo. And there's not a single person who said 14,000 people being killed in Kosovo was too little or too much.
Here's my question. When I look at the humanitarian intervention argument, as much as I sympathise with it, is it not the case that you start from a position where you assume a benign intent, a benevolent motivation on the part of great powers like America or Britain or France, when there's very little evidence for that? There's no reason to assume that the United States of America is a moral agent on the international stage, rather than just simply a self-interested actor. All of these countries act on self-interest, not moral basis.
It's both. It is not a shame to take care for a country of its self-interest. A president of America, of France, has to take care of the self-interest of his country. Now, when this is combined with the interest of the truth or of the least worst, it's great when you have the two combined.
But do you understand why people who are opposed to intervention, especially in some of these countries, are so suspicious? How can they take Sarkozy seriously when he's the guy who's been arming Gaddafi, or David Cameron, or Obama?
They are suspicious because today the last ideology is the plot theory. The last, Marxism is dead, all big narratives are dead. You have left that, conspiracy theories. People are always trying to see what is behind the curtain. Sometimes there is not a lot, and sometimes there is nothing. In Libya, there is so much nothing that Obama did not want to go. He was really pushed by public opinion. In Bosnia, I was also on the first rank of the protesters. Again, nobody wanted to go. It took 3 years before, at this time, Clinton, Chirac going. John Major in England did not want to go. Mitterrand wanted Serbia to win, to prevail. And George Bush, father, same, wanted Milosevic to get rid of these terrible and dirty rebels, Muslim rebels of Bosnia. So it took time for them. And why did they do it? Not because they had some hidden interest, because public opinion, which is your viewers, demanded them to do it. This is the reason why they moved.
Sure public opinion is not demanding a military intervention in Syria, or didn't support it and didn't demand it in Libya?
No, in Syria, not enough.
You're saying these wars are driven by the public, not by elites, not by governments, not by militaries, not by lobbies. Really? And to claim otherwise is a conspiracy theory?
The principle of democracy is that our leaders are elected. Are you aware of that?
Okay. Last time I checked, yes.
Okay. Elected by majority of people, by average
Sometimes.
citizens. Yes, in democracy, this is the principle. So, of course, they listen to that. And I believe also that you have also some moral values who are sometimes, who come in the mind, in the brains of people who may seem inconsistent.
Okay.
It can happen.
Well, we're going to draw part one to a close there, and we're going to come back in part two and talk about Iraq, and we're going to hear from our very patient audience here in the Oxford Union. Join us after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Head to Head on Al Jazeera. My guest here in the Oxford Union is one of the world's most famous public intellectuals, Bernard-Henri Levy. We've been discussing foreign military intervention. Let me kick off part two by asking you about Iraq, perhaps the most controversial conflict in living memory. Was that a humanitarian intervention to rid a dictator from power?
It was a mistake, at least, and I thought that since the beginning. It does not mean that those who implemented it were cynical or only guided by the self-interest, as you said before. Some of them might have had some humanitarian motives. I think so. But it was a huge mistake. Why? Number one, because there was not a regional consensus about that. Number two, because there was a big lie. America lied. in order to justify their intervention. And number three, and this is a very important condition for an intervention war having a chance to be just, there was no, on the ground, there was nothing like Northern Alliance in Kabul, in Afghanistan, Massoud, or his inheritors, or like NTC in Libya. This is very important. What makes an intervention possible, doable, possible to achieve is also that you have in the country demanding it, asking for it, a real structure, a real alliance of civil society movements, which means something.
Would you disagree then with those who say that the shadow of Iraq hangs over every debate about military intervention, especially in the Middle East?
This is a sort of counter-example, and we have to keep it in mind. When I pleaded for intervention in Libya, I had Iraq in mind. Every morning when I woke up, I asked myself, are we repeating Iraq, or it is different, or is it opposite?
A lot of people who oppose Libya or were skeptical about Libya or were worried and not sure about intervening in Libya, they also had Iraq in mind, because they would say, how can you take seriously the United States, for example, or the United Kingdom, my own country, how can you take it seriously as a force for humanitarian intervention, for human rights, when those same countries presided over a humanitarian catastrophe in Iraq? The torture in Abu Ghraib, massacres in Haditha, Fallujah, deaths.
Number one.
And these guys are going to do a humanitarian intervention?
Number one, they are not the same. Barack Obama is not George W. Bush. Everybody knows that. The
US military is the US military.
No. America is a democracy. US militaries are under command.
You said in 2003 about Iraq that you were opposed to invading Iraq because, quote, the first effect will be to restart the machinery of terrorism. And you were right about that, in my view. But doesn't that same argument apply in Syria, in Libya, in other Middle Eastern interventions? Don't our interventions abroad, whether it's Obama or Bush, whether it's drone strikes in Pakistan or invasions of Libya, don't they cause terrorist blowback?
So what should we do? Cross the arms and let all the massacres to go to their natural end?
That's your words. You're the one who said, I won't intervene in Iraq because it will restart the machinery of terrorism.
Yes.
So Tony Blair would say to you, what should I have done? Not done it?
No. What he should have done, he should have probably been more careful before intervening. Cameron did the good thing. Cameron intervened in Libya when he knew that he had in front of him reasonable guys of the NTC, good fighters of Benghazi and Misrata. The aim is not to make war to continue after war, it's to stop war. War is horrible. I know wars rather well since my youth. I hate wars. The objective, the target is to stop them, not to restart them.
You say you hate wars, and yet in every conflict, every crisis, you seem to say there's no diplomatic alternative, we must go in.
I always say the reverse.
Well, give me an example where you haven't advocated military action.
Libya, I advocated for a military action. Only when I heard the son of Gaddafi saying that he wanted to transform Benghazi into a big river of blood. Then I thought that unfortunately, diplomacy had no chance. That is the moment when I decided to call Sarkozy.
Coming back to the point about blowback, which is quite an important point, a lot of people are worried about intervening abroad because they are worried about the consequences, especially with the terrorist threat. As part of that narrative, and you've talked about a war within Islam and Islamic fundamentalism, etc., a lot of Muslims would say, this looks like a one-way traffic. This looks like a war on Muslims. This looks like a crusade. What you call liberal intervention, we see as Western intervention in Muslim lands, which has gone on for centuries.
They should open their eyes and they should see that in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in Libya, and those who advocated for doing something in Chechnya, we were trying to help some Muslims. It was not the West against Islam. It was the West trying to extend a helpful hand to a Muslim people massacred by tyrants.
Let me go to the panel here. Peter, you, unlike many conservatives, were opposed to the Iraq invasion. How do you think Iraq fits into this debate, this discussion we're having about the West's intervention abroad?
Yes, I think the analogy with Syria is extremely interesting. Wouldn't it have been better On the Iraq example, I just wonder, it's a heretical thought to think, to have kept Assad in power. And if you are against bloodshed, as you say, it seems to me only consistent to have tried to stop the insurgents and actually have backed Assad.
History of peoples, of a real history of real peoples, is not made by us in our chambers and in our libraries. It is done by real people who revolt, and it is done by real despots who become mad. I think that Bashar al-Assad has become really mad. He and his wife are probably mad today. When you kill 100,000 people like this, without any apparent remorse, there is something which gets not quite right in the brain. So you cannot talk to reasonable part of the guy. And when a people wants to revolt, you cannot prevent. The only thing you can do in real, let me finish, in real history, is to try to help this revolt not to turn into the evil.
Dr. Ranamani, was Iraq a liberal intervention?
It was absolutely not a desirable, neither legitimate nor legal intervention. We cannot put it in the same category as what we're talking about today. Absolutely not.
But what about the consequences? Let's put aside
the
legality.
Consequences,
if a lot of people in
just...
Syria look at the Iraqi refugees who flooded into Syria from Iraq and say, we hate Assad, but do we want what Iraq has?
Well, Syria is divided. People want different things. There is a huge clique who is still supporting Assad. There's no doubt about that. But what the majority of the people want, I believe, they want peace, but they definitely don't want the world to sit around and not help them. The question is, how do we help them?
Okay, before we go to the audience, I just want to raise one more issue with you, which bothers me a little bit, that if the concept of intervention is driven by universal human rights, why is it, from the people who identify themselves as liberal interventionists, why do we never hear a peep, a word about intervening to protect the Palestinians?
You are wrong. You don't listen. You don't listen.
I've never heard anyone make a case for an intervention.
At least
in Gaza, the West Bank, the southern Lebanon. In fact, Tony Blair refused.
I plead since '69. How much does it do? 44 years for a Palestinian state.
That's not what I said. We all want a Palestinian state. An intervention.
We all. I don't know.
A military intervention to protect people who are being killed. In the 2009 Gaza war, people were being killed, 1,500 Palestinians. Yeah. In the 34-day bombing of Lebanon, 1,500 Lebanese, a massacre in Qana. Why did we not intervene?
First of all, the figures you are giving, we're not speaking of the same. Syria,
that's the figures from...
No, 100,000 deads. It's not the same.
So where does the benchmark kick in where we intervene?
There is not a benchmark.
If I'm a mother whose child has been killed in Qana,
right,
you talked about talking to real people. If I'm a Lebanese woman who lost my child in the Qana refugee camp, 16 children killed, would you not want the West to come and defend you from its own ally, the State of Israel, that's illegally bombing you?
If you are a family mother of Beersheba, of Sderot in Israel, living under rockets all the days.
Agreed. So why do we not put peacekeepers in the middle? It's America that vetoes it. I agree with you. Put peacekeepers in to protect Israeli civilians and Lebanese civilians and Palestinian civilians. But it's America and the West that vetoes that.
It shows you that the difference in this situation is clear. It is not...
One's our friend.
I'm sorry?
The situation is that Israel is our friend.
No. The situation is that even less than anywhere else, you have not all the good on one side and all the bad on the other side.
You said about the IDF, the Israeli military, you once said, I have never seen such a democratic army which asks itself so many moral questions.
Of course.
Given the number of human rights reports from the US State Department, the UN, B'Tselem, Amnesty, documenting the massive human rights abuses by the IDF, doesn't that dent your credibility as a humanitarian interventionist?
No. I can give you as many reports showing that these soldiers try to avoid civilian casualties. I could give you so many examples of that, which I saw with my eyes.
Okay, let me go to the audience now. Who would like to come in and make your points or questions?
Hi, I'm Palestinian, and I would like to know where you get your moral standards from, because some ex-Israeli soldiers have come out against the immorality of the Israeli army, saying that the Israeli army indoctrinates their soldiers continuously to kill Palestinians. And I can take you to Palestinian neighborhoods personally and show you the experiences that me and my friends have been through.
First of all, Israel is a democracy. is a democracy.
Does that give it immunity from carrying out war crimes?
First of all. Number two, Israel is, for the moment, except Libya, the only country in the area where Arabs have real democratic rights.
You seem to treat democracy as some ideal panacea, a solution for the world. So my question is, can you show me a democracy that doesn't take an interest in the spoils of war?
You are probably right. There is no perfect democratic leaders. They always may have in the back of their mind their self-interest, probably. But this self-interest does not always prevail. And there is a huge difference for my country, for example, or for yours, between the imperialist wars of the 19th century and even the 20th, the massacres in Algeria committed by France, a huge difference between that and what happened in Libya or in Mali. It's a great difference. It's a huge progress. And that is why this idea of humanitarian intervention represents a real progress in civilization.
Okay, let's take some more questions, criticism, points. Gentleman here in the glasses.
One of the biggest stains on our conscience is not Iraq, it's Rwanda, where we didn't go in. So it's not that we can stand back and say...
We did go in, some of us went in on the wrong side. Some would argue the French were on the side of the Hutu.
The French were on the wrong side for a long time, and after the genocide started, instead of stopping it, they assisted their allies to get across the border instead of ending the killings. Yes. But what I'm saying is that we also have to consider the cost of not intervening. So whilst we have Iraq on one shoulder, as you talked about earlier, as a helpful counterpoint, I think it's misleading to have this debate always looking to Iraq and never looking to, for example, a case like Rwanda. And in that case, we then have to rebalance ourselves a little bit, remembering that we can't sit here and be very smug and make arguments about how bad it is to intervene, pointing to the difficulties and assuming that that gets out of moral responsibilities for these atrocities.
Okay, let's take some more questions. The gentleman here, and then I'll go to you. The gentleman here in the red tie.
We all know you are the architect of the intervention in Libya, and you got lots of blood on your hand. I mean, I'm asking you, yes, you know that you and Mr. Sarkozy were plotting on this one. My question is, what you were doing in Benghazi with Abdul Jalil when there is a president in the country called Muammar Gaddafi, and the Libyan troops has the right to come when there is a Zionist in Benghazi plotting with other people against their own country.
I fear I did not get the point really. A Zionist in Benghazi? A Zionist in Benghazi? I'm not sure I got it. No. I was a reporter, a French reporter, a human rights advocate who was deeply moved by all that he saw in Benghazi and who was deeply shocked since decades by the style of dictatorship of Gaddafi.
Well, actually, I think the Syrian people haven't asked initially for military intervention. Before talking about military intervention, why do not allow the Syrian people to receive some weapons to defend themselves and topple this regime and stop the bloodshed in Syria?
Because less weapons is better than more weapons. If we could stop the plane of Bashar al-Assad, stop the tanks, topple Bashar al-Assad, it would be better than introducing even more weapons in the area. War has to be hated. Violence has to be decreased. Everything has to be done to have less violence and more. Sometimes...
How quickly do you think the conflict would be over if your solution of no-fly zones... if what you advocate happened, you called him a paper tiger.
Of course, if Putin, if the Chinese and the Russians had not hijacked the Security Council of United Nations, if they had not acted as gangsters, as they did, and hooligans, world hooligan, I think that Bashar al-Assad would be toppled since long. At least he would be imprisoned in his palace with his tanks blocked and with his planes stuck on the ground. It would be a big progress.
How long would it take, roughly? Are we talking? We've already been at conflict for 2 years or more.
A few days. A real no-fly zone.
There are 23 million people in that country. Do you not think by now the people would have got rid of him? If really the majority of the people in Syria did not want their president, he would be gone.
I don't know what the majority of Syrian people think, but I know what Bashar al-Assad does. And a man who is able to kill 100,000 people and probably more is unworthy to govern his country.
Okay, madam, you've made your point very strongly, very passionately. Let's take some other cases. A gentleman here has been waiting for a while in the blue shirt.
I don't believe it's a case of human rights. I don't think we base these decisions on human rights. If we did, then we shouldn't just intervene in Saudi Arabia. We should really intervene in Palestine. We should intervene in China. We should intervene in Russia. And dare I say, we should even intervene in the United States itself. So the point is not about human rights over here. But in parallel, I think the point is it's all about critical mass. In Kosovo, I believe we reached critical mass. In Iraq, we didn't. In Libya, I believed we did. In Syria, as our friend over there said, we did not demand intervention. Syrians, as one myself, we did not demand intervention for quite some time. It was only until the regime showed a very brutal and ugly face and used not just tanks, but Scud missiles and chemical weapons that the people started demanding for intervention. And here's the point. The definition for this critical mass point, which in Syria we have not reached, but we have actually surpassed. The definition is when intervening is bad, but not intervening is even worse. And in Syria we have gone to the point that we are now asking or taking help from people who we know that their future or their ideology for the future of Syria may be an atrocious one, but we're so desperate, we're prepared to take help from them for nobody else will.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So as a Syrian who is... As a Syrian, you're saying even though you don't trust the United States, your desperation means you're willing to take help from the United States?
Absolutely. Syrians today will take help from whoever they can. And let's be
all Syrians? Majority of Syrians?
No, let's be quite clear. I'm not living in cuckoo land. There are Syrians who will support Assad all the way to their own deaths. But I can confidently say that a huge proportion of Syrians, even if we simply take the 4 million that have been displaced both internally and externally, want to see the end of this man. Otherwise, a quarter of the population has no future in their own country.
Gentleman there in the back row with the jacket.
As a Libyan, I'd like to make it very clear to the panellists who mentioned that the intervention wasn't successful. I'd say, of course it was successful. If the intervention didn't occur, for all I know, many members of my family in Libya would have died, and many, many more Libyans would have died. The intervention was very successful. It saved lives. The intervention caused a parliament to come about, 200 members, freely electing, free speech. That was never existent before.
I did in Libya, but successfully, what I did all my life. I spent a big part of my life trying to push the cause of human rights. Very often, I failed. And I have one shame in my life, a real shame, which is Rwanda. I remember 1994 as a year of shame for all of us, for the French in particular, and even for me, because I could not make my voice being heard. So in Libya, I did the same, except that it worked. If I had an agenda, it was to try once in my lifetime to show that an alliance between an Arab country and the West was possible, and that this alliance was able to topple a dictator.
Okay.
This was my dream, and this was achieved.
I have a question about the role of the philosopher and the intellectual in a democracy. Because from the perspective of democracy, I find it quite irritating that you as an individual citizen have the power to contact Sarkozy directly and influence such important policy decisions. So do you speak from the perspective of an individual citizen? Do you think you speak from a universal morality? Or do you think you represent the French people when you contact Sarkozy?
You are right to be irritated. You are right.
Can we all ring up the Elysee Palace switchboard and get through?
You are right to be irritated, but I think that it would have been much more irritating to see the tanks reaching Benghazi and destroying Benghazi. Believe me, much more irritating than the simple citizen talking with his president and convincing him to make a step in the direction of peace. Believe me.
The gentleman there has been waiting very patiently.
I think you don't live there in Libya. You don't live in Sabha. You don't live in Bani Wali.
Are you Libyan yourself?
I am Libyan. Yes. Just maybe you come and visit for one day and you go back. I think you should really look back to the outcome. Libya is divided, is condemned to maybe the Middle Ages, and Libya has no future. It's in disarray, and you see the militias are ruling the countries. There's tribal divisions. The oil is no problem with the oil. The oil goes straight away to your country and to the West.
One of the common criticisms of liberal interventionists, you must hear this all the time, is that you see a crisis, you call for military action, once it's all over, you move on to the next crisis, and no one sticks around to see what happens afterwards. So Kosovo may or may not have been a just intervention to save the people, but Kosovo turned out afterwards to be, breed all sorts of drug traffickers, human traffickers, sex traffickers, etc. You move on. Do you ever go back and check on the previous wars?
This is true. This is not a critic on military intervention. This is a critique of the new spirit of democracy in modern age. Democracy has a sort of short-term tendency to move away from a spot where the spot is no longer enlightened by the big lights of history. This is true. But what should we do? We have to condemn that, and we have to try to improve that.
We're out of time, and I just want to ask you one last question before we go. You said earlier you're not a politician, and you're not a soldier, you're not a statesman, but you are, as one of our audience members said, someone who can pick up the phone and ring Nicolas Sarkozy. You're well known for making these calls for intervention. In those interventions, innocent people die. As someone who's not in government, in the army, you're a philosopher, a journalist, a traveller, how much does that bother you? How much does that keep you awake at night?
It bothers me less than doing nothing and trying nothing. What really bothers me was what I saw every day in the 11 or 12 journeys I made to Bosnia between 1992 and 1995, to see innocent civilians killed in the indifference of nations. This bothered me a lot.
Okay. Bernard-Henri Levy, thank you so much for joining me here on Head to Head. Thank you to all of you here in the Oxford Union for joining us. Thank you at home for watching. We will be back here in the Oxford Union for the next episode of Head to Head next week. Good night.